So, I drew 12 gods from Norse mythology. I grew up with the stories of the Norse gods, but the actual depictions of them was always a mishmash from different sources. I had never really defined a complete visual idea of what they look like for myself. Now, obviously, there are interesting depictions of the gods in media, and one of the highlights being God of War. But I wanted to take a different approach, an approach where I really looked into who the characters were based on the original sources, and how those sources described them, which wasn't the simplest task, to be honest. The first god I drew was Tyr, the Norse god of war and justice. Tyr is also the name from which we get Tuesday. It literally means Tyr's day, which really emphasized how important this god was to many Germanic cultures, especially the Vikings. Because Tyr is the god of war and justice, he always struck me as a stable character, with both feet firmly planted on the ground. And I always imagined him as a tall character, taller than Thor and Odin, which is also how they did it in God of War Ragnarok, but I'm trying to do my own interpretation here, and this is just how I always imagined it. I was aiming to create gods with slightly period-accurate clothing and gear, so Tyr was granted a tunic and a cape. To me, Tyr was always this slightly angry military general, but still remained calm and collected. And in my head, he had a great mind for strategy, so I wanted to emphasize a thinking head with a slightly bulbous cranium. But since he is the war god, he should also have a bit of scarring in the face to show what he has been through over the years. When I got into the coloring, I could really get into emphasizing one of the most essential features of Tyr, his missing hand, which he lost as he risked life and limb, literally, to help the gods bind the massive wolf Fenris. I played around with the beard for Tyr quite a lot, but I was too afraid of it looking like how I imagined Odin, to be honest. So instead I opted for a trucker mustache, which I ended up really liking for some reason. His clothes and coloring was quite straightforward. He never struck me as a god who liked to show off his riches, but I did give him a red cape to emphasize the feeling of war and battle. The next god I did was Bragi, a god of poetry and music. Most depictions of Bragi strike me as the slightly somber character, but I always imagine him as a party animal. He was married to Idun, after all, a Norse god of youth and fertility, I think, so I figured he would have been pretty happy. One version of Bragi I read is one where he was a mortal so talented in poetry and song that Odin granted him godhood in Valhalla. I always thought this was a brilliant story and made him stand out from the rest. Gods have a tendency to be perfect, so to show his mortality, Bragi is not as perfectly fit as the other gods, if you can say it that way. Because Bragi was known for his poetry and song, I thought it would be ideal to give him a large book filled with poetry and lyrics he had written over the years. And although the Vikings didn't really use paper, I figured a god could get his hands on some. He does have friends in high places after all. Bragi is always depicted with a lyre, a type of harp. It was actually pretty tricky to get this integrated with the rest of the character, but I think really figuring out the hand pose made it all work. Vikings were known to have tattoos, and I thought it would be great to give this rock star a few across the chest. His face ended up having a lot of emotion as he was really getting into a certain singing tune, so I put some extra love into that area. I think overall, Bragi might actually have become my favorite of all the gods I made. Somehow he just ended up being incredibly divine. After Bragi, we are taking a more somber step as we're going to look at Hel, who's technically not a god. She is a giant and the daughter of Loki, but she's often considered to be a goddess of death and the underworld Niflheim where she reigns. Hel is described as corpse-like, half dead and half alive. I somehow always imagined her as quite tall. She is giant after all, so I gave her a tall, lanky, slightly irregular body. I gave her long hair, long droopy clothes hanging off her body, and a long wooden staff, everything to kind of emulate a hanging body of sorts. Next to her I positioned an undead person to help show her as the ruler of the dead and to also show her scale. And more than any of the gods, I think the colors were very important. I wanted her to be more muted and desaturated than the rest. I made her staff pale and bone-like, and I tried to decay her skin by amplifying the blueness of her skin in places to show the lack of warmth in her body. The lighting was also very interesting and fun to figure out. I wanted something very dramatic and obscuring to make her seem more freaky and horror-like. I ended up really liking the drama present in her face, and the small detail of the underling being blindfolded and neatly holding a piece of cloth brought it all together for me. Balder was the next character. Somehow Balder was very tricky for me to design, especially with the awesome portrayal of him we saw in the God of War game. But I was sticking with the theme of designing them according to how they were described in the source material. And Balder was described as the most handsome and beautiful of all the gods. So loved and gracious that he actually gave off a light. To me that sounded superhuman, even for gods, so he had to have another side to him. Maybe a slight hint of a Jaime Lannister or a Prince Charming. Someone who has been overpraised by love and attention, and they now can't live without it. In addition to being loved by all, Balder's mother, Frigg, made all objects promise not to hurt Balder, except for mistletoe, in effect creating a protection spell on Balder. And it is by far one of the core features of Balder, but showing that wasn't immediately obvious for me to depict. But after some research I saw that Vikings had this specific symbol they used to mark protection. So I felt it was fitting that Balder could have one of those across his chest as a tattoo. In the end, Balder felt quite pure, although he did look like he skipped leg day a few too many times. The next up was the goddess keeping all the other gods young and healthy, Idun. Idun was the keeper of a tree sprouting magic apples essential to the youthful life of the gods. I always imagined Idun as beautiful as she represented youth and fertility. But I also always saw her as a god connected with nature, since she was in essence a divine gardener. At this point I'd already drawn Bragi, her husband, and since he was boastful and energetic, I thought maybe she could be more reserved and possibly even shy. To really show her fertility and youthfulness, I thought long hair would be ideal, and then a contrapposto pose with her holding a basket of divine apples really settled her character for me. Red hair just felt like it matched the classic red apples, and yeah, the apples could have been green, but I don't think a lot of Vikings had green hair. I used the lighting to also emphasize her shyness and her reservedness. By not casting her front and center, it gave her the feeling that she was hiding her beauty a bit, and also felt like she was standing under a tree, which was a bonus. I think apart from Bragi, she was possibly my favorite. In the Book of Gods I was now creating, they were definitely the power couple. If you were a Viking, you would probably have been a fan of sailing, and you would probably have wanted to pray to the god Njord. Njord was the god of seafaring and wealth, and unlike Poseidon, he wasn't the god of the sea itself. In Norse mythology, giants usually held the positions of representing elements of nature like the ocean and fire. Njord is the father of Frey and Freya, who are both fertility gods, so they must have gotten it from somewhere, I thought. And I thought a wild, slightly horny sailor would be a perfect fit. I imagined him as this short, energetic man with a lust for sailing and treasure, which seems to fit the Viking ideal a lot in my opinion. So I wanted his whole being to depict a certain type of pride in conquering. To help with that, I let his foot rest on the skull of a killer whale. The skull is a bit on the small side, but maybe all the gods are just a bit on the big side, so who knows. Njord was also a god of crop fertility and fishing, which also very much reflects the essential aspects of Viking culture. I'm a bit surprised that he isn't more represented among the Norse gods, but in my book he should be amongst some of the top tiers, like Thor and Odin. Overall, I really enjoyed making Njord. He was a fun character to draw. I especially liked the trinkets wrapped around his neck and forehead. Like father, like daughter, Freya was next on the list. Now Freya is quite interesting. It is still debated whether Freya and Frigg was the same person, because they had so many similarities in terms of what they were the goddess of. They were both gods of love, fertility, marriage, and prophecy, and the way I see it, probably both were true. In some places they were the same, and in others they were different. The design of Freya was actually pretty tough. I started out with a sketch for the character, which I really liked, but I think I lost a bit of the energy over time. I imagined her as a happy life enjoyer, also to mimic the personality of her father a bit, signified by a great smile. One of the visuals we're given about Freya is the fact that she had a falcon cloak and a falcon shape, meaning that she could transform into a falcon. I wanted that to be central to her design, so I gave her a long, full cape of falcon feathers, and I sort of imagined she would have wrapped the cloak around herself like the witch in Spirited Away and then transform into a flying falcon. In the end, I really liked the design for Freya, but I lost a little bit of the energy in the first sketch, so I would probably go back and make a few changes. A few letters apart, we have the brother of Freya, Frey. Frey is also a fertility god, often depicted in the form of a small figurine with a somewhat phallic feature. Beyond that, Freya is also a god of peace, which I think is quite funny because he is one of the few gods who is specifically characterized to have a sword. And not just any sword, a magic sword that fights on its own. Instead of making him into a warrior, I kind of saw him as a slightly laid-back type. And then I used his magic sword to indicate something else, just to pay homage to this 1,000-year-old portrayal. He's also by far the least dressed of the gods, but between being a fertility god, a god of harvest and peace, he kind of struck me as a person who was maybe into nudism. No judgment. And I had kind of been going with the theme of tattooing everyone, so Frey also got his tattoos. Of all of them, Freya was by far the fastest one I made. I think combined it took just over an hour to finish him. Sometimes it just goes like that when making something. After Frey, I moved into some of the really big guns in Norse mythology, and none are really bigger than the leader of the gods, Odin. Odin was a very interesting character to draw. Along with Thor, he's possibly the god with the most depictions in media, but the goal for all of these were really to create a very faithful version of Odin based on descriptions. It was very clear in my mind that Odin had a long beard, a telltale sign of wisdom and being a kind of wizard, I guess. And even though his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, act as messengers and scouts, I always imagined them accompanying Odin everywhere. In similar fashion to Tyr, Odin is associated with thinking, knowledge, and generally a person of the mind, so he kind of got the same treatment of boldness to suggest that. However, many depictions I found describe an Odin in search of personal power and with the ability to shapeshift, and he kind of struck me as a god with slightly hidden motives. So to show a darker side of him, I gave him a heavy black tunic. And Odin is also associated more than any god with runes, so his white cloak could be adorned with many runes. Overall, Odin turned out very Odin to me, which is what I was going for, so that's good. After Odin, I began with the champion of lightning himself, Thor. Thor might have been the most challenging and most interesting to draw. Thor, especially in popular culture, is in a league of his own with how people see him, and I've always had my own vision of how he looked from a very young age. And I think that vision was almost granted when God of War revealed their depiction of Thor. In my opinion, an almost perfect representation of Thor look-wise. But I think I always imagined Thor a tiny bit more fit, more godly if you will, so I really looked into the physique of modern strongmen, which is very much underpinned by a large physical frame. Thor to me was always the embodiment of power and strength, but in addition he also has some various famous items associated with him. Chiefly we all know his magic hammer, Mjolnir, but I'm also guessing that maybe some of you have heard of the magic belt he wore, Njord, which apparently doubled his already mighty power. And to top that up, he also wore, and this was new to me, a pair of iron gauntlets called Jerngripa, which I think translates to iron grip-ish. A detail I ended up really liking was the popping veins on his lower arms. Not only do they symbolize his strength, but I also thought they were a nice nod to his association with lightning. In the end, I was quite satisfied with Thor. He for sure looked like he could beat up some giants. And talking of giants, I moved into designing Loki, the trickster amongst the gods in Valhalla. I spent a while looking for visual descriptions of Loki. I always had this sly and sneaky character in mind, as that really fit his character, but many descriptions actually described him as quite handsome, I think it sort of threw a wrench into how I wanted to design him, but I ended up trying to design a handsome version of the character I already had in mind. I think something that helped with Loki was giving him a more calm and calculated expression rather than a sneaky smirk, and instead I created a pose and a stance that would kind of suggest trickery at play. At first I simply planted one hand on the back, hinting that he might be hiding something, but then I turned it into a full knife, which I think really cemented the character. In many ways he's the rogue and the thief of the Norse pantheon gods. Loki was a giant living among gods after all, so I thought I would give him slightly pointed ears to suggest that. And then he could also possibly have a little bit thicker and wilder hair. But in the end I think the shadow and the light really sold the character for me. A slight warm glow was a big hit for me, as there's this particular story where Loki has to beat a fire spirit in an eating contest, and the fire spirit wins, of course. To end it all, we have the last man standing and the guardian of Valhalla, Heimdall himself. At this point I had done 11 gods and I was beginning to run out of steam. I think Heimdall actually has quite a few noteworthy things about him. He is the guardian of the Bifrost bridge to Asgard, he had amazing eyesight, he has a golden horse, and most famously he had a special horn that would signify the beginning of Ragnarok. Quite a man, to be honest, and I don't really think I did him justice in the end. I really wanted to incorporate the horn, but I should have spent a bit more time integrating it into his pose. There were a few details I did quite like, however. I decided since he was a guardian of sorts, he could be the one god wearing a helmet. And then to reference his golden horse, I gave it a little ornamental piece at the top. I always imagined him as being blonde for some reason, but my research also found out that he was the whitest skinned of all of them, which I thought was kind of interesting since you have Balder, who is supposed to be glowing, but maybe it's sort of more of this golden glow. I just made him pretty fair skinned. Also apparently he was the son of 9 mothers, which I didn't really know how to depict, but a friend suggested that maybe he had 9 navels, which I absolutely loved. It does sound kind of messed up, but luckily he had a belt which was covering that part of his body. So I want you to just imagine he has 9 navels underneath all of that. But yeah, that is pretty much the final god, and with that we have a total of 12 gods to glance at. Overall, it was a really fun challenge to undertake, and for many of them it has actually really helped redefine how I see these characters now. And I learned a lot about them during the process. And I think as a large set, they really work. They work so well together that I ended up making a poster of all of them together. A poster that you can buy over on my store if you want to. This poster is a print-on-demand quality art poster, and I spent a really long time arranging everything in ways that best represented the characters. I especially like this little detail in the bottom left corner of Balder and Loki. Loki ends up indirectly killing Balder, and their poses are sort of mirrored, so there's a little bit of foreshadowing going on right there. If you're interested, you can check it out in the description below. I also recorded the full process for all these gods, and if you want to see the unedited drawing process, then you can also check that out on my store. There's roughly 30 hours of drawing for all of these characters, so that's quite a bit to look through.